Sarah Martinez settled into seat 9B with a tired sigh, adjusting her worn leather handbag beneath the seat in front of her. The red-eye flight from Denver to Washington, D.C. was packed, and she felt grateful to have snagged a middle seat that wasn't completely terrible. At 34, Sarah had grown accustomed to business trips that felt more like endurance tests than adventures. She worked as a mid-level accountant for a consulting firm, crunching numbers and preparing reports that rarely saw the light of day beyond her supervisor's desk. The airplane hummed with the usual pre-flight chaos. Passengers stuffed oversized carry-ons into overhead bins. Flight attendants demonstrated safety procedures to largely inattentive audiences. And somewhere behind her, a baby began the first of what would likely be many crying sessions. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through emails, responding to a few urgent messages about quarterly projections and tax documentation deadlines. She glanced around at her fellow passengers with mild curiosity. To her left sat an elderly man reading a thick novel, his reading glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. To her right, a young woman frantically typed on her laptop, occasionally muttering under her breath about presentation slides and client meetings. Everyone seemed absorbed in their own small worlds, just like Sarah herself. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard Flight 447. Captain Williams had one of those reassuring voices that immediately put nervous flyers at ease. He mentioned the weather conditions, flight time, and cruising altitude in the same practiced tone Sarah had heard hundreds of times before. She barely paid attention, instead focusing on organizing her work files for the meetings scheduled later that week. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Sarah's mind wandered to her predictable life back in Denver. Her small apartment, with its view of the parking lot. Her cat, Whiskers, who would be fed by her neighbor Mrs. Chen until she returned. Her weekend routine of grocery shopping, laundry, and watching old movies on her laptop. Sometimes she wondered if this was all there was, an endless cycle of work, sleep, and minor responsibilities. The airplane engines roared to life as they prepared for takeoff. Sarah gripped the armrests slightly, never quite comfortable with the sensation of leaving solid ground behind. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on her breathing, a technique she had learned from a stress management seminar her company had organized the previous year. During the ascent, she noticed the flight attendants moving efficiently through their post-takeoff routines. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, paused near Sarah's row to check that everyone had their seatbelts properly fastened. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah thought she saw something flicker across the attendant's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. But the moment passed quickly, and the attendant moved on without comment. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, Sarah pulled out a paperback mystery novel she had been reading. The story followed a detective investigating a series of seemingly random crimes that eventually revealed a complex conspiracy. She found herself drawn into the plot, appreciating the author's ability to weave together multiple storylines into a coherent narrative. Reading had always been her escape from the mundane aspects of daily life. About an hour into the flight, Sarah noticed increased activity in the cockpit area. Flight attendants moved back and forth with unusual frequency, their expressions more serious than typical for a routine domestic flight. She wondered if there might be mechanical issues or weather problems ahead, but the pilot had not made any announcements to suggest trouble. The elderly man beside her had fallen asleep, his book resting open on his chest. The young woman to her right had finally closed her laptop and was staring out the small window at the landscape passing below. Sarah followed her gaze and saw a patchwork of farmland stretching toward distant mountains, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the terrain. She returned to her novel, but found herself reading the same paragraph multiple times without absorbing the words. Something felt different about this flight, though she could not pinpoint exactly what was bothering her. Perhaps it was the way the flight attendants kept glancing in her direction, or the subtle tension she sensed in their movements. Or maybe she was simply tired and imagining things that were not really there. A soft chime indicated that passengers were now free to move about the cabin. Sarah decided to stretch her legs and walk to the restroom at the back of the plane. As she made her way down the narrow aisle, she noticed a man in a dark suit watching her carefully. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away and pretended to read a magazine. The interaction lasted only seconds, but it left Sarah feeling unsettled. In the restroom, she splashed cold water on her face and studied her reflection in the small mirror. She saw the same unremarkable features she had always known. Brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a face that would blend into any crowd without attracting attention. Sometimes she wondered what it would be like to be the kind of person others remembered, someone who left lasting impressions wherever she went. Returning to her seat, Sarah noticed that the man in the dark suit had moved to a different location, now sitting several rows behind her original position. The elderly man was still sleeping, but the young woman had disappeared, presumably to use the restroom herself. Sarah settled back into her seat and tried to refocus on her book, though the strange atmosphere on the flight continued to nag at her consciousness. The flight attendant with the kind eyes approached her row again, this time offering beverages and snacks. When she reached Sarah's seat, she leaned down slightly and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Everything all right today, miss?" the attendant asked, her tone carrying subtle undertones that seemed to suggest more than casual concern for passenger comfort. "Yes, fine, thank you," Sarah replied, though she felt anything but fine. Something was definitely happening on this flight, something beyond the normal routine of commercial air travel. The attendant nodded and moved on, but not before giving Sarah another long, searching look. Sarah's heart rate increased slightly, though she could not understand why. She was just an ordinary passenger on an ordinary flight, traveling for ordinary business purposes. There was no reason for anyone to pay special attention to her. No reason for the growing sense of unease that seemed to be building in her chest. She tried to return to her novel, but the words seemed to swim on the page. Instead, she found herself studying the other passengers more carefully, noticing details she had previously overlooked. The way certain people seemed to be positioned strategically throughout the cabin. The fact that several passengers appeared to be traveling alone, with minimal luggage and tense expressions. The subtle but unmistakable signs of people who were not quite what they appeared to be. As the flight continued through the evening sky, Sarah began to suspect that she had somehow found herself in the middle of something far more complex and dangerous than a simple business trip, but she had no idea what that something might be, or why an ordinary accountant from Denver would be of interest to anyone at all. The turbulence hit without warning, jolting Sarah awake from an uneasy doze. Her book fell to the floor as the aircraft shuddered and dipped unexpectedly. Around her, passengers gripped their armrests and exchanged nervous glances. The captain's voice came over the intercom, apologizing for the rough air and requesting that everyone return to their seats with seatbelts fastened. But something in Captain Williams' tone had changed. Where before his voice had been relaxed and professional, now Sarah detected a subtle tension, an underlying urgency that seemed disproportionate to normal turbulence. She picked up her book and tried to focus on reading, but her attention kept drifting to the unusual activity she continued to observe throughout the cabin. 3 rows ahead, she noticed a woman with short blonde hair who kept checking her watch and glancing toward the cockpit. The woman carried herself with a posture that seemed military or law enforcement, alert, controlled, ready for action. Her clothing was unremarkable, but her behavior suggested someone accustomed to dangerous situations. Sarah found herself wondering what someone like that would be doing on a commercial flight to Washington, D.C. The man in the dark suit had returned to his original position, now seated directly across the aisle from Sarah. He appeared to be working on a laptop, but she noticed that his eyes frequently moved away from the screen to scan the cabin. His hands remained close to what looked like a briefcase, positioned carefully between his feet. Everything about his behavior suggested he was waiting for something to happen. A new flight attendant appeared, one Sarah had not seen during the earlier part of the flight. This woman was younger, with auburn hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of passenger behavior. She moved through the cabin, ostensibly checking on passenger comfort. But Sarah observed that she paid particular attention to certain individuals, including the blonde woman and the man with the briefcase. The elderly man next to Sarah stirred and opened his eyes, glancing around the cabin with an alertness that seemed inconsistent with someone who had just awakened from sleep. For the first time, Sarah wondered if his earlier napping had been genuine, or merely an act designed to allow him to observe without appearing threatening. His book, she now noticed, was written in what appeared to be Russian or another Slavic language. 20 minutes later, the captain's voice returned to the intercom. But this time, instead of the usual flight updates, he spoke words that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Williams. We've received updated instructions from air traffic control and will be making an unscheduled stop in Kansas City for operational reasons. We apologize for any inconvenience and expect to be back airborne within 90 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Sarah knew immediately that something was very wrong. Unscheduled stops were extremely rare, typically reserved for medical emergencies or serious mechanical problems. But there had been no indication of either situation, and the captain's explanation was deliberately vague. Around her, most passengers seemed mildly annoyed, but not particularly concerned. However, she noticed that several people, including the blonde woman and the man with the briefcase, appeared tense and alert. As the plane began its descent toward Kansas City, the auburn-haired flight attendant approached Sarah's row. She stopped directly beside Sarah's seat and leaned down, speaking in a voice so quiet that Sarah had to strain to hear the words. "Excuse me, but Captain Williams needs to speak with you privately before we land. If you could please come with me to the galley area, AT." Sarah's heart began racing. She looked around nervously, wondering if other passengers had noticed the unusual request. The young woman who had been sitting to her right was nowhere to be seen, and the elderly man appeared to be sleeping again, though Sarah now suspected he was listening carefully to every word. "I think there's been some mistake," Sarah whispered back. "I'm just a passenger. I don't know the captain, and there's no reason he would need to speak with me." The flight attendant's expression remained professional, but her eyes conveyed unmistakable urgency. "Please, miss. It's very important. There are some questions that need to be resolved before we reach our destination." Feeling as though she had no choice, Sarah unfastened her seatbelt and followed the flight attendant toward the front of the aircraft. Other passengers paid little attention to their movement, absorbed in their own activities or preparations for landing. But Sarah noticed that the man with the briefcase watched them carefully, his hand moving closer to the case at his feet. In the galley area, behind a curtain that provided minimal privacy from the passenger cabin, Captain Williams waited with two other men Sarah had never seen before. Both were dressed in plain clothes but carried themselves with obvious authority. One was tall and lean with graying hair, while the other was shorter and stockier with intense dark eyes. They looked like federal agents or military personnel operating in civilian clothes. Captain Williams studied Sarah's face carefully before speaking. His expression was serious, almost grim, and she realized that whatever was happening was far more significant than an operational delay or routine questioning. "Ms. Martinez," he began, using her name, though she had never given it to anyone on the flight. "We need to ask you about your background and your reason for traveling to Washington, D.C. today." "My background?" Sarah repeated, confusion and fear mixing in her voice. "I'm an accountant from Denver. I'm traveling for business meetings with potential clients. I don't understand why that would be of interest to anyone." The taller man stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Miss Martinez, we have reason to believe that your presence on this flight may not be coincidental. We need to verify certain information about your identity and your activities over the past several years." Sarah stared at them in bewilderment. "What are you talking about? I bought my ticket 3 weeks ago through the company travel agent. I have documentation for all my business meetings. There's nothing mysterious about my presence on this flight." Captain Williams exchanged glances with the two men before continuing. "Miss Martinez, I need to ask you directly. Have you ever used or been known by any other names? Any aliases or code names that might have been assigned to you in the past?" "Code names?" Sarah almost laughed, despite her fear. I'm an accountant. Why would I have code names? I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. The shorter man pulled out a tablet device and showed Sarah a series of photographs. Most showed women who bore a superficial resemblance to her. Similar height, hair color, and build, but were clearly different people. However, one photograph made her breath catch in her throat. It was definitely her, but taken in a setting she did not remember, wearing clothes she had never owned. Where did this photograph come from? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That's what we're trying to determine, the tall man replied. Miss Martinez, I need you to think very carefully. Is there anything about your past, anything at all, that you might have forgotten or that seems unclear to you? Any periods of time that you cannot account for? Any medical procedures or treatments that might have affected your memory? Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the implications of his questions. Memory problems? Medical procedures? The photograph that was definitely her, but taken in circumstances she could not remember? Nothing made sense. Yet she found herself struggling to recall certain details about her past that should have been clear and accessible. As the airplane continued its descent, Captain Williams leaned closer and spoke in a voice so low that only Sarah could hear the words. Miss Martinez, we have intelligence suggesting that someone on this flight is traveling under false pretenses, possibly as part of a larger operation that could threaten national security. We need to know if you might be that person, even if you're not consciously aware of it. Before Sarah could respond, the captain's radio crackled with a message from air traffic control. But instead of the usual landing instructions, Sarah heard something that made her world tilt on its axis. Flight 447, we've confirmed the identity we were looking for. Passenger in 9B is operating under the code name Nightingale. Proceed with contingency protocol. 7. Immediately. Sarah stared at the captain in shock and disbelief. Code name Nightingale. She had never heard those words before in her life. Yet somehow, hearing them spoken aloud triggered something deep in her consciousness. A flicker of recognition that she could not quite grasp or understand. Captain Williams was watching her face intently, clearly noting her reaction to the radio transmission. Miss Martinez, he said quietly. Or, should I say, Nightingale. I think it's time we had a more detailed conversation about who you really are. The world seemed to shift beneath Sarah's feet, as the word Nightingale echoed in her mind. Something deep inside her consciousness stirred, like a door slowly creaking open after years of being locked. Images flashed through her awareness. Brief, fragmented memories that felt both foreign and familiar simultaneously. I don't understand, she whispered, though even as she spoke the words, part of her knew they were not entirely true. I'm Sarah Martinez. I've been Sarah Martinez for as long as I can remember. I work as an accountant in Denver. The tall man pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal dozens of documents, photographs, and reports. Sarah's face appeared in multiple images, but in contexts that made no sense. Training facilities, briefing rooms, international locations she had never visited. At least, not that she could consciously remember. Miss Martinez, Captain Williams said gently. What we're about to tell you may be difficult to accept, but we need you to listen carefully. 3 years ago, a highly classified government operative, known as Nightingale, disappeared during a mission in Eastern Europe. This operative possessed critical intelligence about international terrorist networks and weapons trafficking operations. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the photographs. In one image, she was dressed in tactical gear, standing next to equipment she should not know how to operate. In another, she appeared to be in deep conversation with individuals whose faces were obscured or redacted from the file. The operative suffered severe trauma during extraction. The shorter man continued, his voice clinical but not unkind. Medical records indicate significant head injury, resulting in retrograde amnesia. The decision was made to provide her with a new identity and placement in civilian life while she recovered. with the hope that her memories would eventually return, naturally. The airplane touched down in Kansas City with a gentle bump, but Sarah barely noticed. Her attention was focused entirely on the impossible information being presented to her. She studied the documents more carefully, noting details that seemed to trigger faint recognition deep in her subconscious mind. "You're telling me that my entire life in Denver is fake?" she asked, her voice stronger now, as pieces of a puzzle began forming in her mind. "My job, my apartment, my cat, all of it was constructed as some kind of cover story. Not fake," the tall man clarified. "Real, but carefully arranged. You needed a stable, low-stress environment to heal. The accounting job provided intellectual stimulation without triggering traumatic memories. The consulting firm you work for is legitimate, but they were briefed on your situation and asked to monitor your progress discreetly." Sarah thought about her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, who had always seemed unusually protective and supportive. The way certain coworkers occasionally asked probing questions about her past that she had always attributed to normal workplace curiosity. The mysterious medical bills that appeared to be covered by insurance she did not remember signing up for. "But why now?" she asked. "Why reveal all this during a flight? Why not in some secure government facility or medical center?" Captain Williams exchanged glances with the two agents before responding. "Because 3 days ago, intelligence intercepts suggested that hostile operatives had identified your location and were planning to either capture or eliminate you. The information you possess, even if you cannot consciously access it, remains extremely valuable to foreign intelligence services." The auburn-haired flight attendant appeared at the galley entrance, speaking in low, urgent tones to Captain Williams. Sarah caught fragments of the conversation. Something about confirmed surveillance and multiple assets on board, and immediate extraction required. "The passengers," Sarah said suddenly, understanding flooding through her consciousness. "Some of them aren't really passengers, are they? They're operatives, either protecting me or trying to get to me." "Very good." The shorter man nodded approvingly. "Your instincts are still intact, even if your specific memories remain blocked. Yes. This flight has become a convergence point for multiple interested parties. Some are here to protect you, others to capture you, and still others to ensure you never remember what you once knew." As if summoned by their conversation, the elderly man who had been sitting next to Sarah appeared at the galley entrance. But now his demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the sleepy, harmless appearance he had maintained throughout the flight. In its place was the alert, dangerous presence of someone accustomed to violence and deception. "Gentlemen," he said in accented English that Sarah now realized was definitely Russian, "I believe we need to discuss the young lady's immediate future. My employers have significant interest in renewing their acquaintance with Nightingale." The two American agents immediately positioned themselves between Sarah and the newcomer, their hands moving toward concealed weapons. Captain Williams stepped protectively closer to Sarah, his own posture shifting to suggest military training that went far beyond commercial aviation. "That's not going to happen," the tall agent stated firmly. "Miss Martinez is under federal protection, and any attempt to interfere with that protection will be met with appropriate response." The Russian smiled coldly. "I think you will find that the situation is more complicated than you realize. There are others on this aircraft who share my employer's interests. The blonde woman in row 6, for example, and the businessman with the briefcase. Even your helpful flight attendant there has divided loyalties." Sarah looked at the auburn-haired woman, who had been standing quietly nearby throughout the conversation. The woman's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested that the Russian's accusation might be accurate. "It's true," the flight attendant said quietly. "I work for a private security contractor. My job was to monitor Nightingale and report on any signs of memory recovery. But I wasn't instructed to facilitate her capture." The revelation that even her protectors could not be fully trusted sent a chill through Sarah's consciousness. But along with the fear came something else. A growing sense of clarity and purpose that felt both new and familiar. Her mind began working faster, analyzing the situation with skills she did not remember learning. "The unscheduled stop," she said suddenly. "It wasn't just to get me away from potential threats in Washington. You're planning to transfer me somewhere else, aren't you? Somewhere that multiple foreign intelligence services won't be expecting." "Smart girl," the Russian commented approvingly. "Your training was apparently more thorough than we realized. But I'm afraid your American friends have underestimated the scope of interest in your recovery. There are assets positioned at airports throughout the region, waiting for exactly this type of contingency." Through the small galley window, Sarah could see vehicles approaching the aircraft on the tarmac below. Some appeared to be standard airport service equipment, but others had the distinct look of unmarked law enforcement or intelligence vehicles. The situation was rapidly escalating beyond a simple protective extraction. Captain Williams spoke into his radio, using codes and terminology that confirmed Sarah's growing suspicion that this entire flight had been an elaborate intelligence operation from the beginning. Her ticket, her seat assignment, even the selection of other passengers had all been carefully orchestrated to create a controlled environment for testing her memory recovery. "Miss Martinez," the tall agent said urgently, "we need to move quickly. There are multiple hostile elements converging on our location, and this aircraft is about to become a battlefield. Are you prepared to trust us with your safety, even though you cannot yet remember why you should?" Sarah looked around the galley at the faces surrounding her. The captain, who was clearly more than he appeared, the agents who claimed to be protecting her, the Russian, who openly admitted hostile intentions, and the flight attendant whose loyalties remained unclear. In the passenger cabin beyond, she knew other operatives were waiting for the situation to resolve itself one way or another. Deep within her consciousness, something clicked into place. Not complete memory recovery, but enough clarity to understand that her ordinary life as an accountant had been a carefully constructed illusion. The real Sarah Martinez, the woman known as Nightingale, had been a highly trained operative capable of handling exactly this type of crisis situation. "I'm ready," she said, surprised by the confidence in her own voice. "But I need you to understand something. I may not remember my past, but I'm starting to remember who I really am. And that person is not going to be anyone's passive victim." As alarms began sounding throughout the aircraft, and the first sounds of shouting came from the passenger cabin, Sarah Martinez prepared to reclaim her identity as Nightingale, and to face whatever dangerous truths her forgotten past might reveal.